I think antitrust is generally one of the most important issues in the country right now, because we have these tech companies and they have built amazing things. And they built them in America, right? These tech companies are all American tech companies, and they all founded on important ideals, all engineers who thought they were doing good things for the world, who worked really hard. There's so many admirable things about the tech industry, and it may be the best part of the American economy, creating the most jobs, certainly the most valuable companies. But it is also true that they have gotten really big, and there are a lot of negative consequences. So the question of how we regulate them, can we regulate them correctly? Should we break them up? Could lead us to outcomes which either destroy what might be the best part of the American economy or make it so much better. So in that context, with those stakes, I could not be more pleased than to have Lina Khan, who is one of the absolute smartest people on antitrust, who wrote a paper a year ago that completely transformed the debate in this country, or 2 years ago, has a new paper that just came out, and is working on the House Antitrust Committee right now, is counsel to them. The rest of her bios is she will soon be a professor at a very prestigious law school. I assume they're all fighting over her, but they haven't signed yet. So Lina Khan, absolutely brilliant, has changed the debate on antitrust. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here with her. Hi, Lina.
Hello, thanks so much for the super generous introduction.
So let's get going. So I want to ask the first question, which is that there's this legend of Lina Khan that you dropped out of the sky and you wrote this magical paper on Amazon, and for the first time in his life, Jeff Bezos was scared. But that's not quite right, because you've been working on the issue before. So tell me a little bit about how you got into antitrust, how you focused on tech, and then we'll get into the arguments of paper number 1, and then we'll get into the arguments of paper number 2. My goal for this conversation is to go through Lina's arguments and descriptions, offer some of the counters, so I'm not going to imitate Mark Zuckerberg again today, and then talk about how we could actually do this. So part 1, paper number 1, The Legend of Lina Khan.
Great. So I started working on antitrust issues back in 2011. I had joined a think tank called New America, where there was a program run by Barry Lynn that was focused on 2 things. One was just documenting consolidation across our economy, and second was documenting the effects of extreme consolidation. So, nowadays, the fact that our economy is highly concentrated is a fact that is more widely discussed. But back then, it was not something that many people were paying attention to. And so when I joined, I was assigned, various industries to study. So I spent months studying, the airline industry, the chicken industry, the seed industry, all sorts of metals industries, just documenting how they had evolved. And it became clear pretty quickly that there had been a pretty steady trend of consolidation across the board. And that these enormous mergers and acquisitions over the years had led us to a place where market after market was now dominated by a small number of companies, and that concentration had a whole set of effects. It affected us as consumers, it affected us as workers, it affected us as entrepreneurs, and it also had political ramifications for our democracy. And so this got me very interested in the history of antitrust legislation, which when it was first passed in the 1800s was really a very radical set of laws. These were a set of laws that were designed to disperse concentrated private power. And there was a very clear recognition in the legislative history that in the same ways that concentration of political power threatened democracy, concentration of economic power also threatened democracy. And so, there were these populist roots that informed this legislation. And for various reasons today, antitrust was not applied with these same values in mind. So doing that work led me to law school, which is where I continued some of this work and ended up writing my first paper.
And so what was it about Amazon that set you off?
So at the very tail end of my time at New America is when I started looking at Amazon more closely, and I spent a lot of time just interviewing 2 groups of people. One was the set of merchants and suppliers that sold through Amazon, and the other was venture capitalists and investors that were thinking about Amazon from an investment perspective. And it became very clear that there was something going on here, that Amazon was slowly but steadily amassing structural dominance in some of these markets in ways that I thought raised huge questions for antitrust and for regulation more generally. I should say that one of the big changes in antitrust over the last few decades has been that we've adopted what's known as this consumer welfare framework for assessing whether there is harm. So whereas in the past, when you were analyzing whether a particular merger was anti-competitive, you would look at a whole set of structural factors. Nowadays, the primary focus is on the effects, which oftentimes ends up being consumer prices, output, kind of metrics that should be reducible to consumer effects. And Amazon was a really interesting example because consumers love Amazon. I think it's like the first or second most beloved institution in America, according to a survey last year.
Right? You want a light bulb?
Stuff is cheap. And
light bulb goes out here, they get it to you in like, soon Amazon will give you the light bulb before the light even goes out. They are so efficient and so cheap. Anyway.
Light bulbs, batteries, you name it, it's all there. And so it seemed like a really interesting example and a really interesting vehicle for exploring the story of antitrust and of how I thought this consumer welfare frame was really blind to a lot of harms and negative effects of extreme concentration and dominance that I thought antitrust should pay attention to.
Right. So you say, wait, Amazon, prices are great under the old Borkian standards of antitrust where we just look at consumer pricing. You couldn't possibly bring a case. But if we go back in time and we look at how we used to define antitrust, there's a much broader case you can make against Amazon. So that's paper number one, right? You put out paper one, and it causes this huge sensation. Everybody gets excited. It gets downloaded something like, I don't know what it was, 160,000 times, which excellent number for a law paper. Yeah, at Wired, like that's a great number for readership, but we actually measure the amount of time spent reading. So 160,000 readers times, it was what, like 12,000 pages long? Lots of time spent reading the document. All right, so you write that, helps change the debate about antitrust. Now let's talk about your new paper, which just came out.
So my new paper, it's called The Separation of Platforms in Commerce, and it's focused on a particular regulatory principle. And this principle basically says that if you're a dominant intermediary, if you're a dominant network, you should not be allowed to enter lines of business that place you in direct competition with all of the businesses that are reliant on your network. So, 100 years ago, railroads transformed America. There were, in some instances, monopolistic. They also started then buying out coal mines and entering various kinds of commodities businesses. This caused all sorts of disruption because all of a sudden the independent coal producers found that they would go to the railroad and guess what? There were no cars that were available for the independents because the railroad was privileging its own coal. And so Congress ended up doing a big investigation and ended up passing a law that said common carrier railroads are prohibited from transporting any goods in which they have an interest. And so this basic principle we've continued to apply in the banking industry and telecom, to TV networks. It was a part of the AT&T breakup. And so this paper really kind of revisits that history and identifies the various goals that these remedies sought to promote. And my aim really with this paper was to recover this history of breakups that I think has been lost. In the last few months, there have been various presidential candidates and various policymakers talking about breakups. And I think, one avenue of reaction was really like, oh, this is just a really exotic and extreme remedy. This is un-American. Why should we punish success? And I think revisiting this history reminds us that actually, when you're a dominant intermediary, when you're a dominant network, there have traditionally been a very separate set of rules that we've applied because we see these market players as different.
All right, so the examples of this behavior would be, for example, Amazon GE sells light bulbs on Amazon, but now Amazon sells light bulbs within the own marketplace that Amazon created. Apple runs an app store, but you also can get Apple apps that are competitive with the apps that you purchase through the App Store. What are some of the other examples of marketplaces where the companies enter? Oh, Google, of course. Google has created search, which it uses to advantage its own products. What are some of the other examples that are particularly important?
Yeah, so I think you see it with Google, you see it with Amazon, you see it with Facebook, insofar as Facebook has extended into some aspects of content.
Yep.
You suddenly have Facebook content competing with all of the publisher content that's dependent. You really see it also with Apple, with Amazon, insofar as you have the marketplace and the private labels, but you also have other parts of the business with regards to cloud and its physical logistics infrastructure. So I think it's something that you're starting to see or have been seeing across the board in this way.
And so what are the full implications? The full implications of your paper are not split these companies in 8 pieces. For Amazon, it would just be stop selling stuff in your marketplace. And that's a pretty small part of Amazon's business, right?
Yeah, I think it would basically prohibit Amazon from selling its own Amazon labeled goods on its platform. I think there's an open question about how it would potentially apply to other parts of its business. And I think traditionally we applied this remedy for a variety of reasons. One was because there was a recognition that when you have a dominant company that is both the main avenue and artery of commerce for all these other businesses, but is simultaneously competing with them, that can create a conflict of interest that distorts the economy more broadly. There was also a recognition that this kind of dynamic would also potentially allow firms to cross-subsidize. So, if you're a monopolistic firm that's earning monopoly rents in the business in which you're dominant, and you're using those rents to then subsidize entry into all these other markets, that could also distort competition that way. There were a host of other reasons that were focused on, wanting to promote diversity in the press, around wanting to ensure that systems were not too fragile. So in the banking industry, for example, one reason why we haven't traditionally allowed bank holding companies to go out and buy oil tankers is because you recognize that this would expose them to sorts of vulnerabilities that would render this infrastructure quite fragile. I think now we're starting to see how, in cloud computing, for example, these firms are also playing an infrastructure-like role, and so whenever you see a potential outage, a small part of the internet goes out. And so I think there are similar questions around fragility and vulnerability that are also being raised. So I think this is, a very traditional remedy that we've applied. I definitely think that there are some difficult questions to be worked out if we were to apply it again to the tech firms, but I think I really wanted to push back against this idea that these are extreme or exotic remedies.
Right. So one of the themes that runs through all of your writing is, I'm not saying something radical and new, I'm just saying something that everybody believed until, 1965? Is that?
The 70s, yeah,
70s,
sometime.
okay. So let me ask you, you have a very interesting part in that paper where you make the argument that you can show that the rise of these giant tech firms has made markets less competitive. Explain how you did that.
In this new
paper.
So there's a variety of research now coming out, and I think this is actually what's helped shift the debate more broadly. In the last few years, there have been a host of empirical studies that have been showing that investment in some of these markets are going down, that Silicon Valley as a whole is struggling to encourage innovation in ways that are not simply, startups looking to be bought up by one of the big companies. I think there's more empirical work to be done, but there is a sense that this marketplace is not as competitive as it once used to be. Yep. I think a major reason is when you have dominant platforms competing with businesses reliant on them, there's also a huge information asymmetry that they can exploit and chill innovation that way. So, famously, Facebook several years ago purchased Anavo, which is that VPN server that gave Facebook, detailed insight into which rival applications were diverting attention from Facebook, and then it was able to use that information to go out and buy competing products. You see a similar dynamic with Google and Amazon, and so there is, I think, also a worry that if you bring a good product or service to market, but the big guy will kind of steal your business, copy your idea, roll out a replica service, that you're not actually going to be able to reap the investment that you put in.
Amazon is clearly sniffing on potential competitors within the marketplace, right? It decides to sell light bulbs because it studies how people buy light bulbs and sees an inefficiency and a way it can win in that market. Like that, I'm 100% convinced by. Amazon also provides the cloud infrastructure for most of the internet, like Netflix runs on top of AWS. Do you think Amazon is sniffing on its AWS infrastructure to identify market opportunities?
I don't know. There was I think 2011.
Is anybody from Amazon here? Can you?
I should also note, by the way, in case I didn't say this, that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not implicate the House subcommittee. There was some reporting a few years ago where an Amazon executive noted that Amazon Web Services does give them insight into which startups are growing very quickly, and that they were able to use that information to then selectively invest through their venture capital arm. And I think more generally, given just how many different lines of business Amazon is involved in, there is immense opportunity to cross-leverage data in ways that I think.
So if this is true, so earlier I was like, okay, it's not that your paper doesn't lead to that big a remedy. It just means that Amazon can't study how the light bulb market works and sells its own Amazon-branded light bulbs and batteries, right? Which is, Amazon could live with that. But actually, if they're sniffing on the cloud infrastructure, you would have to split AWS from the Amazon marketplace, which would be a huge change, right?
Well, I think you would basically have Amazon Web Services separate from any competing services that were using Amazon Web Services, right? Because the information asymmetry would potentially let Amazon then enter into any other lines of business. So you basically just have AWS as a standalone, right? Because theoretically, any company that was using AWS would suddenly be vulnerable to Amazon.
Right.
So I think.
Anyway, very, very interesting. I hadn't even thought of that before this conversation. You see, this is why it's so great to have Lena Khan here. All right. Do you think that the consolidation in tech has led to more income equality in the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, there have been a whole set of factors that have contributed to immense income inequality. I think excessive consolidation throughout the economy is probably a significant factor. So there's been a host of empirical research that shows that consolidation has meant that labor markets are less competitive. And what happens when you go from a marketplace where you have the choice of 10 potential employers to a marketplace of 2 potential employers is that your bargaining power goes down. And so there's a pretty direct correlation between increased concentration of labor markets and decline in wages. So I think there's a good reason to think that that's connected. It's also become more difficult as markets have become more consolidated to start a new business and to compete that way. For a lot of families, having your own business has been a key way to kind of pass down wealth. And so insofar as it's become more difficult to do that, I think that's one avenue to the middle class that is being more blocked off. And so I think there are a whole host of ways in which consolidation can make it more difficult to have greater economic equality, let alone increase in prices and that sort of thing.
Okay, so that's part one, laying out Lena Khan's arguments. Go to part two of what I hope will be part two, which is the counter argument. So let me start with counter argument number one, which is, I don't know, having all this tech integrated is awesome. How many people here went into Google, typed in Hotel Jerome, and then clicked on directions, right? Which works really well because Google Search is integrated with Google Maps, and then it tells you, like, you're 6 minutes away, take a left. It's so good to have all these things integrated because they have all the data and they can be more efficient. And if you split them up, you type it into Google, you have to open a whole new Maps app. It's a nightmare.
I think with Google, it's not just the search, but I think it's also the Android location data. So it's just like all these different forms of data that are being pumped in. Look, I think there are definite trade-offs, and I think there are trade-offs with almost every policy intervention. I think a lot would depend on how you structured this. So, it's possible that you wouldn't want to separate Google Maps from all the other ways in which Google's accumulating data, but you would maybe want to separate it from Android, given that Android is a platform for competing maps apps, and insofar as potential discrimination is locking out competitors, that could be one place where you would want to cut it off.
But people search for location on Bing, right? So in a way, like the whole search is a competitive product too. You might want to split it off from search, right? For the same logic?
So the argument would be like insofar as the Maps
I could search
is
for
writing.
Hotel Jerome on Bing, but I'm not going to get a Maps app to open up immediately. So it gives Google Search an unfair advantage over Bing or DuckDuckGo.
That's right. I mean, I think this is where you also need to start thinking about other remedies, like in the vein of interoperability, right? So if you are allowing all sorts of different maps to integrate with Google Search so that it's not just the default Google Maps that's showing up in Google Search, I think that could be one way to engender more competition in that market.
Okay, let me make another counter argument, which is one Mark Zuckerberg did not make on stage, but that Sheryl Sandberg has made publicly, and the tech executives are making more and more, which is that you have to have national champions, right? And in artificial intelligence, which is one of the most important technologies of the future, you need lots of data, you need centralized data systems, you need lots of compute, you need the United States to be strong in it. We break these companies up, we tie their shoelaces together and kick them in the shins all day. They're going to get weaker while Alibaba, and Baidu and Tencent just get stronger because the Chinese government is helping them, and then we have an AR Cold War and we lose.
So this is not the first time that we faced this set of choices between, whether to go the national champions route or whether to instead try to inject more competition in our markets. As Tim Wu has very elegantly written about, back in the 70s, we faced a similar set of choices, and we instead chose to break our companies up. And that ended up, encouraging a whole wave of innovation, especially in the telecom space, whereas countries like Japan that did end up going the national champions route ended up, being more stagnant. I think it's also worth pushing back against the idea that breaking up these companies would just necessarily lead us into this downward spiral. If you believe that it is this concentration that is closing off entry and potentially affecting innovation, it could actually encourage much more competition and much more innovation in ways that would make us much more competitive going forward.
Though Mark Zuckerberg did address that particular argument on stage, and what he said is, if you break us into smaller companies, we will compete on all the bad things and everything will get more complicated. In fact, it's quite useful. If we're trying to stop Russian misinformation in the 2020 election, it is quite useful for the NSA to only have to call a couple of companies, not 20 different companies. There are advantages to having big centralized companies because they can do good things. They can hire 30,000 people to look for hate speech and terrible things on the platform, as Facebook is doing. So his argument was, the good we're doing is possible because we are large. And if you break us up, all the small companies that follow will just compete on growth, not on privacy and security.
Yeah, I think it's worth thinking about, whether the magnitude of the problem is what it is because you have such consolidation, right? So if having many more Facebooks would actually limit the degree to which you would have whole-scale Russia interference, I think that it makes it less likely that you would need to actually call up the companies in the first place. So I think I just don't buy the idea that you would only see competition on the bad things and not on the good things. Over the last few years, as we have heard about data breach after data breach, you've heard a lot about people shutting down their Facebook accounts, kind of going off the platform, and instead, just keeping their Instagram and WhatsApp accounts, which of course are also owned by Facebook. And so I think there's been a very clear signal in the market that people are trying to find other options, and the marketplace currently is not providing them. There's a great article by Dina Srinivasan called The Antitrust Case Against Facebook, where she outlines how Facebook actually became as popular as it did in part because it made a lot of privacy commitments. And so at that time, when it first hit the market, it was competing against MySpace. MySpace was undergoing all sorts of scandals around being insecure and allowing a lot of data insecurity. And Facebook was able to compete on privacy. Once it became more dominant is only when it was able to basically just start stripping away some of those privacy protections. And so I think having a more competitive marketplace would potentially provide much more privacy in the marketplace.
All right, now I'm going to give you the argument that I've been channeling other people in the last three arguments I gave. This is the argument that I genuinely believe in, what makes me most worried about antitrust, which is our government moves really slowly, right? Facebook, just invented a whole new global currency, right? Technology companies move really fast. Our government moves really slowly. Based on the evidence the last couple of years, they're not as deep in technology issues as I would like them to be. An antitrust investigation would possibly be led by Trump's Department of Justice, which I don't entirely trust to handle it completely fairly. If you look at the conversations about antitrust, a lot of it is coming from the Republican side because of a belief that the platforms are biased, which makes me think that in the final antitrust decision, it will be made by Diamond and Silk. And so I have this sense that our government doing antitrust is just going to be, outmatched, outgunned, outnumbered, outplanned? I mean, I just don't know whether I trust our government to do this efficiently, and the stakes are so high.
I think that's a very legitimate worry, and I think the potential misuse of antitrust enforcement as a weapon against political enemies is definitely something that has made a reappearance under this administration in ways that is quite troubling. I guess a couple of things. One is that antitrust is not the only tool, and I think most advocates of antitrust are very well aware that antitrust is just one tool, and that even if you broke up these companies, that would nowhere near solve all of these problems. And so I think these companies are complicated. They are presenting a host of different problems, and so I think partly what we have to do is disentangle the problems and identify, which of the tools apply to which part of the problem. So there is a whole regulatory toolbox that we have in the past also applied that has the benefit of, not requiring an antitrust lawsuit that would potentially take a decade. You could have, faster intervention. The FTC has something called rulemaking authority that would enable it to do, very targeted studies and identify what potential remedies to introduce more quickly. So I think, the institutional landscape is a bit broader than just DOJ, FTC doing antitrust suits. There have been a variety of studies over the last few years that have floated potentially creating a new agency that would be much more equipped with technologists that were studying these issues more closely on a day-to-day basis. So I definitely agree. I think both the speed challenge is real and also the information asymmetry challenge is real. But I think we've addressed new technologies in the past, and I think partly it's just about figuring out how to equip government to do so.
All right, so there's a good way to do antitrust and there's a bad way to do antitrust. So put yourself in the shoes of somebody in the audience who has bought everything you've argued for the last 25 minutes. Completely agrees there's the problems, agrees in platform separation, agrees in your diagnosis of the structural remedies, agrees with the general sense that technology as it exists right now is slowing innovation, perhaps increasing income inequality. How are they to know when the antitrust remedies being proposed are in the good antitrust bucket versus the bad antitrust bucket?
If being done through like a DOJ that's prosecuting and that sort of thing?
Whether it's being done for political motives by people who don't understand the technology and are going to screw it all up versus being done by people with a broad understanding of the law who are working with the best interests of American innovation and the economy at heart?
Yeah, it's a great question. Antitrust is a law enforcement tool, and so in order to bring a case, you have to put together a theory of harm and ultimately make your case in front of a court. I think this question actually came up more recently with the AT&T Time Warner case where the Department of Justice sued to block. It was in some ways a case that was a bit risky. It was a vertical merger, which is the kind of merger that the antitrust authorities have not challenged in quite some time. And so on the one hand, people were left thinking, oh, maybe this is a very active enforcement agency. But there was also the backdrop of statements from the president suggesting that he had personally either instructed or suggested that the agencies block the merger. And so I think it's a very difficult situation. I guess I will say in that case.
And to pause, it was not that he had suggested they block the merger because he thought it was anti-competitive. It was because he doesn't like CNN.
That's right. And so, I think this is, a world in which we're already currently living and is presenting tricky questions. I guess the fact that, at the end of the day, you do have to make your case in front of a judge, right? It's not just overnight the Justice Department decides and the next day the company's broken up. And the fact that if you have good congressional oversight, that should be a check. There was a time in the, I think, late 60s or early 70s where there were also concerns about improper enforcement actions by the antitrust agencies, and Congress actually passed a law called the Tunney Act, which basically it introduced a greater review process, and so it means that there are more checks along that avenue. So if the antitrust authorities enter into a settlement, you actually have additional layers of court review that are basically trying to figure this out and trying to figure out, is this remedy really in the public interest? So I do think that the current processes have important checks in place that would limit the degree to which somebody unilaterally could start using law enforcement as a political weapon. But I totally agree that this is a very real possibility.
Right, because if Trump, his fundraising on Facebook isn't as successful as 2016, he might say break up Facebook. But let's go through the different areas where antitrust, because there's a lot of antitrust action at a lot of different levels. So sort of for the last few minutes before we move to audience Q&A, there's action at the FTC, there's action at the DOJ, there's action in the House that you're part of, there's action at the state levels, which actually just did some important actions against T-Mobile and Sprint. There's action in Europe. Explain the landscape of antitrust and what the best way for the audience to think about it is.
Yeah, so I think, for the last few decades, most people have focused on the antitrust agencies as being the primary vehicles of any and all antitrust. And so you have the Department of Justice, which does very traditional law enforcement. You have the FTC, which also does very traditional law enforcement, though the FTC is actually has a lot of regulatory authorities that they haven't been using. So I think the FTC could be much more empowered in this antitrust space if it wanted to. Congress has also been a bit more muted in the last few decades. So in the 50s and 60s, Congress played a very active role in antitrust. They routinely had investigations that were calling in executives and were trying to understand how various marketplaces were working. And they would produce these, multi-volume records that were really capturing, what's broken in the marketplace and why is it broken broken, and is it broken because Congress needs to fix the laws, or is it broken because the agencies aren't doing their jobs? And so Congress had this periodic reassessment and was very active in making sure that the antitrust laws were still able to do what they were supposed to do. For various reasons, since the 80s, Congress has just taken much more of a backseat role, and it's entirely the judiciary and the executive agencies that have just totally transformed antitrust. And so partly why I think this moment is so important and exciting is because Congress is again interested in antitrust. And so insofar as there's been this wholesale intellectual revolution in the law that totally bypassed the actors that are supposed to make the law, the fact that the lawmakers are again paying attention is really important. Yep. I also think antitrust is, I think, most robust when people recognize what it is. And so insofar as there's also this greater public awakening and awareness that, hey, this is a really important set of tools and we should empower our agencies and our government to ensure that our marketplaces are competitive, I think that could also have important ripple effects. Europe, as you noted, has had a very active antitrust, has had a lot of antitrust activity in the last few years, especially around some of these tech issues. I think over there, the open question is how effective will their remedies be? So the European Commission has now brought 3 cases against Google, all of which have culminated in various levels of fines. But there is a complaint by a lot of market participants that fines alone are not really enough to fix the marketplace and make it more competitive.
They'd have to give $1 trillion fine for Facebook to notice.
Yeah, and I think there's a similar question happening right now with what the FTC is potentially going to do. And so I think Europe is a really important presence, but I think historically has not really been as focused on structural remedies as the U.S. has been. So those are the main actors in this space. The state AGs have historically also played a really important role at key moments. So the Microsoft litigation actually in part started at the state level. There was an important Monsanto investigation that also started at the state level. And as you mentioned, they recently filed to block Sprint T-Mobile. So I think
but where is the locus going to be, right? If I were to say I'm going to take a Wired reporter and we're going to find one person working on antitrust and we're going to profile them, should it be somebody at the FTC, somebody at the DOJ, somebody in a state, somebody in Congress, or somebody in Europe?
I think all of these institutions have the potential to play a really important role. I think at this moment, I would say the states and Congress are probably a bit more interesting, in part because I think they are responding to what they perceive as inactivity by the agencies.
Right.
And so insofar as they're kind of realizing that they can be empowered and act in this space too, it's just creating a really interesting dynamic.
Okay, there's one other avenue where the debate about antitrust is playing out in interesting ways, which is the Democratic presidential campaign. I know you can't possibly endorse any candidate, but explain which candidates have put out positions on antitrust and how they differ.
So there have been a few candidates that have put out positions on antitrust, both as part of the campaign, but also before joining the campaign. It's actually been really remarkable to see just how much antitrust is now part of the campaign. I think the last time it was such a central part was in 1912, where you had kind of Wilson, Taft, Roosevelt kind of fighting out what they were going to do about monopoly. So it's enormously exciting. Amy Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, has been pretty active on antitrust in the past. She was on the antitrust committee in the Senate and has put out a series of bills that would make important fixes to the antitrust laws, though they are slightly more incremental. They would, shift the presumption in certain cases, raise, filing fees and that sort of thing. Senator Booker has also introduced bills. He introduced one that would put a moratorium on mergers in agriculture markets. So agriculture is an industry that is super consolidated. You have all sorts of market power that is, hurting farmers in many ways. And that would be really interesting because I don't think we've actually just had a straight up moratorium on mergers in any industry for quite some time. Senator Warren obviously is also quite an important player in antitrust. She introduced the proposals that would break up platforms in certain ways. And
Very
has also
much
been,
like the ways that you proposed in your second paper.
That's right. There are resonances between the proposals. And she's, since 2016, been quite active on this, not just in the tech space, but in the industry more, across the economy more generally. So I think, it's going to be really interesting to see as the campaign continues how these issues continue to get talked about.
Okay, we're going to move to audience questions and answers. If you'd like to, here we go, fire away, right here, fourth row.
Yes. Previously in your discussion, you talked about, for the example, a light bulb product and excluding Amazon from competing on its network by selling light bulbs. A little esoteric, but if you consider information a product, one of my concerns is that a few companies are owning, controlling information, raw information, data, at such a mass level that is that in of it, forgetting about the privacy issues, is the controlling of information at the raw level by very few companies an antitrust issue, a monopoly in and of itself?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and I think it's an enormously important issue. I think insofar as it's these few companies that are acting as central marketplaces and are collecting all this information on activity, that's definitely creating huge asymmetries in terms of who in the future is going to be able to enter, say, the AI space, right? So insofar as all of this information is feeding machine learning, I think the current market structure has huge implications for who's going to be dominant in AI. Traditionally, access to information has at times been a concern that the antitrust agencies consider when they're assessing mergers, but I definitely think that digital markets means that it has to be like up front and center as a factor that the agencies are assessing.
What would be a remedy that would open up information and make it more possible for startups in artificial intelligence to get data that would allow them to compete with the huge data repositories at Google and Facebook?
I think one proposal would be to just open up those repositories and make it something that companies had access to, right? So in the 50s, we had a remedy that basically required Bell Labs to open up its patent vault. And so everything that, all of these patents that had been proprietary were no longer so, and that there have been great papers showing how that spurred whole waves of innovation. Because all of this proprietary stuff that had been locked up was now suddenly open. I can imagine something similar in certain parts of these. You look very skeptical.
That's what Cambridge Analytica did. Cambridge Analytica got access to Facebook's data, and the world wasn't so happy about that.
I think you have to be careful about how you do it, what information you're, allowing them to do that with. Is it personally identifiable information, or is it aggregate information about market trends? So yes, there are, definitely ways in which you could do this that would make us all less secure and have less privacy. And there can be, depending on how you structure this, huge privacy trade-off. So yeah, totally hear that. But I don't think it's a, totally foreign concept.
Fascinating. Right here in the second row.
Thanks. You mentioned that Congress is now getting back in the game, and I know that your subcommittee has said that they're going to have 12 or 18 months of hearings. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on there, and also germane state proceedings that we should pay attention to?
Sure. So the Antitrust Subcommittee has been quite active. It's not just in the tech space. They've had hearings on, the Sprint T-Mobile merger. They've been very active on drug pricing issues. More recently, they did announce this investigation into tech markets more generally. And that was really, I think, responding to the fact that there's a growing realization that there's a huge problem here, but it seems like nobody's really been doing anything about it, right? The FTC has been investigating Facebook for over a year now for this huge breach. Haven't seen anything there. DOJ has been pretty dormant. And so I think in Congress, there's this, hunger to figure out what's wrong and figure out what Congress should do about it. And so, the investigation that Chairman Cicilline announced is going to have a few parts to it. One is going to be hearings. So a few weeks ago, they had their first hearing that was looking at the effects of market power on the free and diverse press. So insofar as, Facebook and Google have become these super critical portals of how people access information online, that has huge ramifications for journalism. Similarly, the central role that they play in digital advertising has huge ramifications for the financial viability of a lot of publishers. And so, they had a hearing where they had a set of publishers come and testify about the problems they were facing. They're also going to be having a few more hearings down the line, as you mentioned. And so the goal here is really to do a lot of fact-finding and to establish a record to document what kind of conduct is happening here. Separate from the hearings, the subcommittee is also going to be hearing from a lot of market participants who are too scared, frankly, to be public about these issues. I think oftentimes companies are very dependent on these big platforms, and so being public about concerns can lead to economic retaliation. And so part of what the investigation is taking this broader form is because we wanted to create a forum for people to be able to come and talk, not on a public panel, but privately, but in ways that could then feed into a record and create a roadmap for what Congress should do. The second part of your question was about the state?
State regulation or hearings.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any hearings, but there have been various reports in the press that the states are also investigating Facebook and Google and potentially gearing up to bring a case, which I think would be really interesting to see. And I think that's an area where you'll see this bipartisan interest playing out.
But I will note that whoever runs comms for your committee is a genius by holding the first hearings about the press, because you're definitely going to get good coverage when you do that. Right here, please.
Thank you. Oftentimes you see big business actively lobbying for more regulation. Look at the Dodd-Frank bill, which instituted this idea of too big to fail, which means that only the big banks can afford the lawyers and the accountants necessary to meet with the regulations. So my question really is, short of antitrust, what can the government do in terms of deregulation, perhaps, so that big tech can't create this moat around itself that stifles competition?
Good question.
Yeah, this is, it's a great question. I do think sometimes it gets overstated, the degree to which regulation is, creating this huge asymmetry in the marketplace. I think a lot of that depends on how you're structuring the regulations, and, there are all sorts of regulations that actually help create more of a level playing field in these markets. I think, when I think about what are the issues that are keeping smaller players from being able to compete on a level playing field, a lot of those things have to do with, what kind of access do they have to the same kind of resources? Are they being discriminated against? And so I think as a first order matter, ensuring that they're, competing on a level playing field are the remedies that I think jump out. I think there are definitely ways in which you could impose regulations that would create more of these moats and just benefit the big guys. And I think that's why you need to have thoughtful investigations that are really hearing from market participants and identifying which regulations would do that and which wouldn't.
In the front row, we had a hand up.
Type my question before I asked it. Okay. I was wondering if there's any examples of antitrust leading progress when it comes to green alternatives.
That's a great question, and it's not something I'm very steeped in. The Open Markets Institute, which is this think tank that studies anti-monopoly issues more generally, I think has been doing some work as part of that, and I believe the Green New Deal proposal actually has a provision in it that is focused on kind of deconcentrating some of these markets as a way to kind of get us to clean energy more closely. So it's a great question. I think people who are working more closely on those issues are figuring that out. But there are definitely arguments being made that extreme concentration and consolidation in energy markets could actually hamper how quickly we kind of shift to more renewables.
Let's go all the way, just make it difficult for the people with the mics, all the way to the far side on the left.
From the far side.
Yes.
I'm not sure how to ask this question. A large portion of my wealth is involved with Amazon, but only because I use the company a lot. And I think it's a wonderful thing. I mean, I can sit here and order a kilo of Denesi coffee and have it delivered to my rental place by tomorrow. There is nothing that they're doing and even when they ask me, do you mind if we channel your information or whatever, I think it's terrific because they know what I'm interested in. The company, it just bothers me that you're even contemplating breaking this company up. I think they do so much good. They bring hundreds of companies to my attention on selling things. Light bulbs is an example. I happen to use them to buy light bulbs. And now, if you don't use them, you have to search around for 40 different marketeers of light bulbs. It's not easy. So I just do not understand this. And in the case of Facebook, when he called for more regulations, it made a lot of sense to me because there are so many issues that if his company picked one, another company will pick it in a different way. So where are we going? And how are you going to hurt my portfolio?
So again, I think there's no doubt that consumers have in many ways benefited immensely from Amazon services. I think it's a question of what's happening in the rest of the ecosystem and the rest of the marketplace. So yes, on the one hand, Amazon has enabled many more merchants and suppliers to get to market through this one portal, but there are a whole host of issues that come up in terms of how Amazon is wielding that market power vis-a-vis suppliers and producers. I get dozens and dozens of emails from merchants that have been delisted overnight. It happened to correlate with when Amazon introduced a rival product. All of a sudden, they're having to lay off, dozens of workers. There's no appeals process. And so I think, part of this really gets to, is this a fair marketplace? Is this a marketplace where if you're an independent producer and entrepreneur, you have a good idea, can you bring it to market and compete on the merits of that product? And I think the marketplace that we're currently seeing raises a lot of doubts about whether you can actually compete on the merits of your product. And so I think a lot of this is really about promoting a more competitive economy and a more competitive marketplace that will deliver even more innovation and better products at the end to consumers.
From the consumer's point of view, it's a great marketplace. And there are more consumers than there are sellers.
I think, it comes down to a question of, are you really going to make policy by just viewing the individual as a consumer? Arguably, we did that with Walmart, right? Some of these same arguments were made about Walmart that, yes, on the one hand, it may be decimating local communities, it may be underpaying its workers that are now reliant on food stamps, but their prices are so low, and so that's so great. I think the Walmart experiment is one now that, if you go back and study, shows that the trade-offs between just privileging the consumer are actually very real. And so, there was just a report that came out yesterday that showed that Walmart is a dominant provider of food retail in upwards of 40 counties. And so there are all these food deserts that have emerged, and Walmart is the only provider. And it's a really great report, and I think shows some of these trade-offs in practice in a very real way.
And just a stock tip, if it does indeed get broken up, if Lena does break up these companies, it's not clear that they will be less valuable when split apart. Jefferies just put out a research report saying that Google will go up if broken up, and so you will still be able to come to the festival next year. So I've got a call on my uncle or my cousin. I'm going to go with my cousin.
Wise choice. Lena, I just wanted to ask you briefly to speak on net neutrality, as our very first question was talking about information as such an important product. What role does net neutrality play in terms of antitrust?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think of net neutrality as an anti-monopoly principle. So insofar as what net neutrality is trying to do is it's trying to prevent the gatekeeper from abusing its power to pick winners and losers in the rest of the economy. And so that's a non-discrimination principle that I think has a lot of resonance for other antitrust principles. And I think some of the challenges that we're now facing with the platforms are kind of like net neutrality part 2. Insofar as, yes, even if you have the ISPs that are not allowed to discriminate or throttle, if you still have these platforms that are able to do that, what kinds of distortions is that going to create? And so I think in many ways, some of the non-discrimination proposals that have been flagged by various candidates and policymakers are very much kind of an extension of net neutrality.
All right, now my uncle, and then the front row. We have 2.5 minutes. Let's get 2 more questions in. So Charles, pass the mic to your dad.
Thanks a lot. My question is a little bit to the side of antitrust, but I think it relates. How do we incentivize individuals in the economy to care about their information sufficiently to want transparency, accountability, and maybe even a share of the economic benefits? I have just been in China, and I can assure you that young Chinese don't care a bit. They understand that their whole lives are transparent to WeChat and to the Chinese government, and it really doesn't matter to them. And I fear that the same is the case here. And what worries me about that is it permits, even in a restructured or somewhat more controlled market, these companies to use the monopolization of attention to sell advertising and to reap the economic benefits of controlling big data to really run the show. And I was just hoping you might have some ideas about how to get a more engaged, involved, and motivated public of users to demand greater internet democracy, if you will?
Yeah, it's a huge question, not one I'm nearly going to be able to do justice to in this short amount of time we have. But, you know, I think, I guess on the one hand, I wonder if the tide is turning, given kind of the, you know, serial revelations about how Facebook has been reckless with people's data, and people seem to be actually upset about that. But even short of that, I mean, I do agree with you that if you just talk about privacy as privacy, it can seem very abstract, right? One thing you hear is, well, maybe I don't have anything to hide. Why should I care? So I think what really needs to be worked out a bit more is really documenting and showcasing how that information is being used. So if all this information is being used to price discriminate, so that, you know, you go online, you pay one price for a product, you know, your uncle pays another price for a product because Amazon or whichever other company has decided that he's in a higher income bracket, I think that kind of discrimination is something that is going to make people upset. I think there are more and more stories of how this information can be used in concrete and tangible ways that are harmful that I think is going to further help change this. But I think it's a very real challenge.
You ended at 000 precisely. One thing about antitrust, we're out of time. One of the things I said is that what I think is most important is that we have government officials who understand the issue, who think about it seriously, and do their very best. So I am very grateful that Lina Khan is in our government. I thank you for that, and this will be extremely interesting to watch. Thank you all for coming.